All right, welcome to our next part. We are now going to look at the connection between Solomon Spaulding and Sidney Rigdon. And usually the rebuttals that are made by LDS apologists in regards to this is the following. Number one, Sidney Rigdon was neither employed or connected with any print shop in Pittsburgh. Two, there is no evidence to indicate Rigdon was ever in Pittsburgh before 1822. And then three, Rigdon denies in a letter he wrote to an editorial that he did not have any involvement with Solomon Spaulding or his manuscript. And so the LDS argument is that the Rigdon did not have the opportunity, nor was he at the right time and place to have stolen the manuscript because of the time gap, in which I'm showing you here. 1812 to 1816, Spaulding had moved to Pittsburgh. 1814, Spaulding moved to Amity, Pennsylvania. And in 1816, we know that Spaulding died. And then it was said that now we know that Sidney Rigdon may not have lived in that time period, but the question is, did he frequently visit Pittsburgh? That's the question we need to ask, because we do know in 1822, yes, he starts preaching for the First Baptist Church in Pittsburgh, and in 1830, we know the Book of Mormon is published. So is there a connection? Well, let's look at some of these. Number one, we're going to look at Rebecca Eitbaum's statement. She says, my father, John Johnson, was postmaster at Pittsburgh for about 18 years, from 1804 to 1822. Okay, that's the right time frame. My husband, William Eitbaum, succeeded him, was postmaster for about 11 years, from 1822 to 1833. I was born August 25th, 1792, and when I became old enough, I assisted my father in attending to the post office and became familiar with his duties. From 1811 to 1816, I was the regular clerk in the office, assorting, making up, dispatching, opening, and distributing the mails. Pittsburgh was then a small town, and I was well acquainted with all the stated visitors at the office who called regularly for their mails. So meager at that time were the mails that I could generally tell without looking whether or not there was anything for such persons, though I would usually look in order to satisfy them. I was married in 1815. In the next year, my connection with the office ceased, except during the absences of my husband. I knew and distinctly remember Robert and Joseph Patterson, J. Harrison Lambden, Silas Ingalls, and Sidney Rigdon. I remember Reverend Mr. Spaulding, but simply as one who occasionally called to inquire for letters. I remember there was an evident intimacy between Lambden and Rigdon. They very often came to the office together. I particularly remember that they would thus come during the hour on Sabbath afternoon when the office was required to be open, and I remember feeling sure that Reverend Mr. Patterson knew nothing of this, or he would have put a stop to it. I do not know what position, if any, Rigdon filled in Patterson's store or printing office, but am well assured he was frequently, if not constantly, there for a large part of the time when I was a clerk in the post office. I recall Mr. Ingalls saying that Rigdon was always hanging around the printing office. He was connected with the tannery before he became a preacher, though he may have continued the business whilst preaching. Now, here's interesting. So you read some of the details that she gave. So was she present during this time? Well, she said she was married in 1815, right? And sure enough, in the Commonwealth Pittsburgh newspaper, October 28th, 1815, married on the 12th institute by Reverend Joseph Stockton, Mr. William Eitbaum, to the amiable Mrs. Rebecca Johnson, daughter of John Johnson, postmaster in this place. And then she recalled a detail. She said, I particularly remember that they would thus come during the hour on Sabbath afternoon when the office was required to be open. And, of course, she doesn't understand. A lot of people don't understand the Sabbath, but some people think that the Sabbath is Sunday. But let's go with it. So she had said, remember, at post offices when the mail arrived on Sunday, the office, I remember there's an evident intimacy between Lambden and Rigdon. They very often came to the office together. I particularly remember that they would thus come during the hour on Sabbath afternoon when the office was required to be open. Now, she's writing her testimony some 50 years later. Remember that E.D. Howe had also somehow made a connection in the relationship between Lambden and Rigdon. But anyways, so she gets this detail right because a law that was made on April 30th, 1810, at post offices where the mail arrives on Sunday, the offices be kept open for the delivery of letters and for 1 hour after the arrival and the sorting of the mail. But in case that would interfere with the hours of public worship, then the office is to be kept open for 1 hour after the usual time, as dissolving the meetings for that purpose. And then here's the interesting thing. So during this time, if you didn't come pick up your mail, they would actually write down your name and put it on this list for you to come pick up the mail. So interesting enough, look at some of these dates here. May 5th, 1813, Solomon Spaulding needed to come pick up some mail. November 10th, 1813. September 7th, 1814. February 4th, 1815, John Spaulding and Solomon Spaulding are written on it. The Commonwealth, Saturday, February 11th, 1815, John Spaulding, Solomon Spaulding. Saturday, February 25th, 1815, John Spaulding, Solomon Spaulding. Ah, look at that. July 9th, 1816, Sidney Rigdon is on there, and also Solomon Spaulding is on there. And then September 5th, 1818, Sidney Rigdon. November 7th, 1818, Sidney Rigdon. So what does this tell you? It tells you that Sidney Rigdon actually came to pick up the mail quite regularly in the post office, or else they put your name on this, right? You can see there the letters, Statesman. This is November 7th, 1818. But, it's very interesting seeing that one, the list of letters on July 9th, 1816. That's the one I find the most interesting one of all, is that Sidney Rigdon and Solomon Spaulding were found both on it. So Mr. Patterson stated to me that Mr. Spaulding brought the manuscript to the office, and of course it came under the charge of Ingalls, and at about that time, Ingalls spoke to Mr. Patterson about it. That time must have been 1814 or 1815. All of the old men of our church knew about Rigdon hanging about that printing office, and whether he spent his time there in copying it or concocting his schemes while conversing with Ingalls and others, or at length procured the manuscript by purchase or otherwise, makes not the smallest difference. If it is true that Mrs. Spaulding had the manuscript returned to her, then unless Mr. Spaulding had duplicate copies, leaving one in the office, Rigdon must have copied it. The identification of the Mormon Bible with the novel of Mr. Spaulding I consider complete and placed beyond cavil. Now, I wish to write about Joseph Patterson. So this is probably the Patterson brother that that Solomon Spaulding dealt with more than he did with Robert Patterson. He was Mr. Joseph Patterson, who I suppose was in with his brother Robert before Lambton came into the firm. He married a very wealthy lady, built a long block of buildings on one of the principal business streets, 6 producing high rents, retired from active business, and finally moved to Philadelphia to enjoy his fortune. I knew him well. I have no doubt you are right in the matter of Mr. Spaulding's statement concerning the interest Joseph Patterson had taken in the manuscript. But Mr. Spaulding not being able to furnish the money for its publication, there it remained. I have never supposed that Rigdon ever saw Mr. Spaulding, for at that time he had not as yet come on the stage, but finding such a document there shown to him by Ingalls in 1822 or 1823, it's hard to tell when Sidney Rigdon may have came across this manuscript. But I do not think he ever wished Patterson to publish it, thinking he might turning it to account and making a fortune. And suppose the novel was returned to Mrs. Spaulding, it being a strange production, Ingalls might, during his leisure hours, have copied it with the intention of making something out of it, and perhaps not being able to publish it, sold it to Rigdon. Any one of these, Lambton, Ingalls, Joseph Patterson, or Rigdon, might have taken a copy. I think Rigdon had his plan of a community formed. Indeed, the old members told me that when in Pittsburgh, he often broached the subject to them of a common stock system, as he then called it, before he met Joe Smith, and at first expected to use him as a tool to carry out his plans. So that it may be that Rigdon had a little community begun at Kirtland before he met Joe Smith. But I remember well the report that Parley Pratt, the tin peddler, told Rigdon of Smith, and was the means of bringing them together. And I suppose it was 1829 or 1830. Mostly likely, anyways. Another thing I learned that about the time they published the first edition of the Mormon Bible, they established a bank at Kirtland without a basis, issued notes, and the elders put them into circulation. I saw one of the notes. I hope you will persevere and collect all the facts and publish an authentic history of that huge impostor. You will see that by my pamphlet that you can get nowhere else the first facts in the history. I feel thankful that I can help a mite toward the object. I was sick for 3 or 4 weeks, but I recovered. But if I can aid you further, I should be glad to do it, Judge Cobb. Very respectfully, Mr. Williams. So, if you think about it, she was present during that time. We can see that. We see that she is corroborated by that Sunday law, by the marriage. She got detail right about her marriage. She was married in 1815. Look at her details. I think it's very interesting how accurate they are. And does she have anything to gain if she's lying about this? Really? I don't see any ulterior motive in her. Then there's Joseph Miller, which we've talked about. She says, my recollection is that Spalding left a transcript of the manuscript with Patterson for publication. The publication was delayed until Spalding could write a preface. In the meantime, the manuscript was spirited away and could not be found. Spalding told me that Sidney Rigdon had taken it or was suspected of taking it. I recollect distinctly that Rigdon's name was mentioned in connection with it, and that was the resident of Amity, Pennsylvania. And then we came across John Winter. You'll remember him. He was one of the early ministers of the Baptist Church, laboring in western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, and during a portion of the time when Sidney Rigdon was a pastor of the First Baptist Church in Pittsburgh, Dr. Winter was teaching a school in the same city and was well acquainted with Rigdon. Upon one occasion during this period, 1822 to 1823, Dr. Winter was in Rigdon's study when the latter took from his desk a large manuscript and said in substance, a Presbyterian minister, Spalding, whose health had failed, brought this to the printer to see if it would pay to publish it. It is a romance of the Bible. Dr. Winter did not read any part of it and paid no more attention to it until after the Book of Mormon appeared, when he heard that Mr. Spalding's widow recognized it in the writings of her husband. The authority for the above important statement is the Reverend A.G. Kirk, to whom Dr. Winter communicated in a conversation. And notice this, in New Brighton, Pennsylvania, in 1870 to 1871. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Dr. Winter died at Sharon, Pennsylvania, 1878. Mr. Kirk conveyed this information to the President Rye by letter, March 23rd, 1879. Now, we do know that Mr. Winter, he definitely thought that Rigdon was unsound in his teachings and tried to actually get him, withdraw fellowship from him, or they call it excommunication. But it's interesting that he wrote this, 40 years later. He gets called upon by someone to write down his testimony. So it seems to me that if this person really wanted to have an axe to grind against Rigdon, he would have done so earlier. And that's, of course, my opinion. Mary Irvin, the daughter, I have frequently heard my father speak of Rigdon having Spalding's manuscript and that he had gotten it from the printers to read as a curiosity, as such as he showed it to my father, and that at the time Rigdon had no intention of making the use of it, that he afterwards did. For father always said Rigdon helped Smith in his scheme by revising and making the Mormon Bible out of Reverend Spalding's manuscript. This is also confirmed by A.J. Bonsall, who was the stepson of Dr. John Winters. And then we have this. So what about Mr. Winter's statement? Even though, yes, it is secondhand testimony. He says, few years ago, Mr. Winters, I'm sorry that I'm compelled to mention his name, said to be a regular Baptist preacher from England or Wales, was sent or came to Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in the depth of winter with a large family in the most abject circumstances. Brother Sidney Rigdon was then bishop of the Baptist Church in Pittsburgh, and as a Christian bishop ought to do, he took pity upon his brother Winters, took him into his house with all of his family, say 7 or 8 children, and sustained them for some weeks, I know not how many, and finally rented upon his own responsibility a house for his brother Winters, and stirred up the brethren to minister to his wants. He was also invited into the pulpit, occasionally proclaimed his tenets to the congregation. After he had got warmed and filled, he began to make a faction of the church by insinuating that his brother Rigdon was not sound in the faith, though he had been very round in charity towards him. He said that the church had departed from the faith once delivered to the Welsh saints and was no longer built upon the foundation of John Gill and Andrew Fuller and the Philadelphia Confession. By creeping into houses and leading captive silly women and some 2 or 3 men, he made a faction amounting, I think, to 12 out from 80 to 100 members. These Mr. Winters called the church, and at the next association which met in that city, an effort was made, which I labored to defeat to make the 12 the church. Thus I became obnoxious to the wrath and resentment of Mr. Winters and his party. They were defeated at that time. Finally, Mr. Winters left the city and went into the bounds of the Beaver Association. Mr. Rigdon also, some 2 or 3 years afterward, left the city, went out into the country bordering on the Mahoning Association. Mr. Winter's party fell for a time under the episcopacy of the celebrated pedestrian Lawrence Great 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 Rake or Great Trake. I don't know. That's interesting. But he and they are not being able to long to hold on their way. A young man from Somerset called Mr. Williams took them under his episcopacy, and he also, instigated by the same faction, wrote a letter to the Columbia Star, setting forth various labels and slanders against me. And this is what Alexander Campbell had written, for which I called him to an account. He then and his brothers Winters both joined the Beaver Association, and not unfrequently since have these gentlemen, especially Mr. Winters, endeavored to sow discord in the neighboring churches. Mr. Winters got into some 2 or 3 churches which once belonged to the Mahoning Association, and there played the same game which he played in Pittsburgh. More and more of these churches were divided by his instrumentality, and since I left home I learned from the minutes of the Beaver Association that he had joined them. This narrative I know is substantially correct in all of its prominent parts, though I write it from my own recollections only. And if pressed, I know I can make it out more fully and circumstantially. But enough is told to show how and why this anathema came out in the minutes of the Beaver Association. Since my notice of the Beaver, and then he writes later on, and I'm glad he saw fit to correct this. Since my notice of the Beaver anathema, I've learned that I was misinformed in some statements concerning Mr. Winter. I hasten to correct them. His name is Winter, not Winters. And in the second place, his family was quite small when he came to Pittsburgh. In the third place, he is said to have landed at Baltimore in the year 1822 and commenced his tour in the United States from that port. These corrections I make lest they should mislead as to the person intended. And then Bosman states, Reverend John Winter was born in Wellington, England, July 1794. He entered the Theological College of the Baptist Church at Bradford, where he was graduated in 1820. His first charge was in South Shields. He married Eliza Wilson in 1819, and they, with one child, came to America in 1822. He preached and taught school at Pittsburgh, preached in various places in Allegheny and Beaver counties, including Rigdon's home church, the Peters Creek Baptist, which he served as pastor in 1825. He wrote much for the religious and secular papers. That's this testimony. So I just wanted to tell you that so far I think we see some collaborative evidence here, right? And then James McAfee says, this testimony brings out the fact that while Rigdon was going forward and upward in the Baptist church, he was tolerably well contented and has not yet conceived of the necessity which finally arose for his establishing a new religion. Hence, in this unguarded moment with his friend, he exhibited and commented upon the Spalding manuscript. In a short time after this, however, upon being expelled from the Baptist church, he was confronted with an emergency which set him to thinking seriously, but inasmuch as he had betrayed his opportunity by so free an exhibition of the manuscript, he contented himself with helping to establish that new religion, now known as Disciples or Campbellites. This he did doubtless for the sake of having further preparatory employment until some of his old associates should die out, and a more favorable opportunity for the launching of his new faith should arise. So I think you can see there that John Winter is pretty substantial in his testimony. Of course, I know it's secondhand, and that's what makes it a little makes it less strong. But also we know, well, I'll just continue. This is Reddick McKee. So he says, Mr. Spalding told me after that he had submitted the work to Mr. Patterson for publication, but for some reason it was not printed, afterwards returned to him. I also understood he was then occasionally rewriting, correcting, and he thought improving some passages descriptive of his supposed battles. In this connection, he spoke of the man Rigdon as his employee in the printing or bookbinding establishment of Patterson and Lambden in Pittsburgh, but about him I made no special inquiries. And then it says later, A.B. Deming's interview with McKee. After consideration and further inquiry, he concluded to remove his family. Spaulding removed his family to that village and then removed in October 1814. Rented the hotel, opened it as a public house but without a bar. Mr. Spaulding told me that while at Pittsburgh he frequently met a young man named Sidney Rigdon at Mr. Patterson's bookstore and printing office, and concluded that he was at least an occasional employee. He was said to be a good English and Latin scholar, was studying Greek and Hebrew and Greek with a view to a professorship in some college. He had read parts of the manuscript, expressed the opinion that it would sell readily. While the question of printing was in abeyance, Mr. Spaulding wrote to Mr. Patterson that if the document was not already in the hands of the printer, he wished it to be sent out to him in order that he might amend it by addition of a chapter on the discovery of valuable relics in a mound recently opened near Conduit. In reply, Mr. Patterson wrote him that the manuscript could not then be found, but that further search would be made for it. This excited Mr. Spaulding's suspicion that Rigdon had taken it home. In a week or two, it was found in the place where it had originally been deposited, sent out to him. The circumstance of this finding increased Mr. Spaulding's suspicions that Rigdon had taken the manuscript, made a copy of it with a view to ultimately publishing the story as the product of his own brain. Whether the manuscript was amended and returned to Mr. Patterson, he did not tell me, but it probably was. So, very interesting what Reddick McKee had to say. And then here's some two witnesses. The next two witnesses are very interesting. She says, when I was quite a child, I visited Mr. Rigdon's family. He married my aunt. They at that time lived in Bainbridge, Ohio. During my visit, Mr. Rigdon went to his bedroom, took from a trunk which he kept locked a certain manuscript. He came out into the other room, seated himself by the fireplace, and commenced reading it. His wife at that moment came into the room and exclaimed, "What? You're studying that thing again?" Or something to that effect. Meaning he frequently did this, right? She then added, "I mean to burn that paper." He said, "No, you indeed will not. This will be a great thing someday." And whenever he was reading this, he was completely occupied. He seemed entirely unconscious of anything passing around him. I mean, here's someone who's someone, as she says, he married my aunt. She was the niece of Sidney Rigdon. And then there was Cephas Dodd, and I know this is secondhand testimony here. And we've already read this one in the past, so I'll just go to that part in blue. Dr. Dodd took Mr. Francis Spaulding's grave. They told him his positive belief that Rigdon was the agent in transforming Spaulding's manuscript into the Book of Mormon. And you have Harvey Baldwin, and unfortunately this is also secondhand testimony, and Deacon Clapp. Harvey Baldwin of Aurora, Portage County, Ohio, says that over 30 years ago he heard his father say that he belonged to the Baptist Church in Bainbridge, Portage County, Ohio, when Sidney Rigdon preached there, and that several times when he called to see Rigdon, he found him in a room by himself, and that each time hurriedly put away books and papers he had as though he did not wish to see them. Deacon Clapp of the church at Garfield attended and mentor. Says he was 18 years old when Rigdon came to Mentor to live, and that he had a large chair with a leaf on the arm to write on with a drawer underneath with a lock and key, and the chair was covered with spots of ink. Rigdon told me he had much use for it. And then Ann Redfield says, in the year 1818, I was principal of the Onondaga Valley Academy and resided in the house of William H. Sabine, Esquire. Remember, this is the brother of the widow of Solomon Spaulding. I remember Mrs. Spaulding, Mr. Sabine's sister, perfectly, and hearing her and the family talk of a manuscript in her possession, which her husband, the Reverend Mr. Spaulding, had written somewhere in the West. I did not read the manuscript, but its substance was so often mentioned in the peculiarity of the story that years afterward, when the Mormon Bible was published, I procured a copy, and at once recognized the resemblance between it and Mrs. Spaulding's account of the manuscript found. I remember also to have heard Mr. Sabine talk of the romance, and that he and Mrs. Spaulding said it had been written in the leisure hours of an invalid who read it to his neighbors for their amusement. And Mrs. Spaulding believed that Sidney Rigdon had copied the manuscript while it was in Patterson's printing office in Pittsburgh. She spoke of it with regret. I never saw her after her marriage to Mr. Davidson of Hartwick. So that's what we see as a secondhand testimony of what she said the widow had told her. Josiah Spalding, remember what he said, brother of Solomon Spalding. Likewise, she, Matilda Davidson, informed me that soon after they arrived at Pittsburgh, a man followed them. I do not recollect his name, but he was afterwards known to be a leading Mormon. He got into the employment of a printer and told the printer about my brother's composition. And then we read about C.E. Henry, which he says, other engagements prevent my hearing President Fairchild's lecture last evening upon the Book of Mormon in its relation to the Spalding manuscript. It has been the popular belief among the older citizens of the Reserve, and especially among those who had personal observation and contact with early Mormonism, that the Book of Mormon was compiled or rewritten, or at least made up in part from the Spalding document, and there was no direct or positive evidence to prove it. From some facts and incidents connected with the career of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, when they were in Geauga and Portage counties preaching their alleged new gospel, I came to the conclusion some years ago that the Book of Mormon was a work of Sidney Rigdon, with perhaps some changes or additions by Smith or others. So far as I know, these facts and circumstances have never been published. George Wilbur, one of the early pioneers of Geauga County, taught school in the winter following the alliance of Smith and Rigdon in a log schoolhouse a mile south of the center of Bainbridge. Rigdon lived in a small log house about 200 yards from the schoolhouse, and young Wilbur, who has heard Rigdon preach before his alliance with Smith, often called on him during the noon hours of recess and sometimes in the evening. Rigdon had acquired the reputation of being something of a biblical scholar among the pioneers, and was also a very persuasive and eloquent preacher. Some of the keen-sighted people, however, had lost confidence in him, and discovered that he had a strong religious ambition that was not tempered by Christian grace and humility. For a year or more before the advent of Smith, they saw that Rigdon was bent on devising some new dogma. In short, to start a new church or sect that he could call his own, or whose leadership he would share with only a few. It may be proper to state that George Wilbur was at that time a young man of high character and good education, and for more than 40 years, no one in Geauga or Portage had a better reputation for truth and moderation. He was the father of Professor C.D. Wilbur, now of Nebraska, who was a roommate of General Garfield at Williams College. He died about 4 years ago at Aurora, Illinois. Wilbur's statement, moreover, the work and conduct of Rigdon that winter was corroborated by some of the neighbors in the school district. Rigdon did not preach that winter, but was almost constantly engaged upon a manuscript that he was writing or revising. Wilbur noticed that towards the close of the term there was much more of it than there was the first time he saw it. And then C.E. Henry writes this. Sorry, I accidentally. Yeah. I haven't finished yet. Sorry. Rigdon had before that time been free and communicative, especially upon religious topics. He now appeared reserved and at times reticent. Whenever any reference about his manuscript, he seemed disposed to parry inquiry by some general explanation that he was making notes or preparing some papers to throw lights upon some portions of the gospel. Following spring, Smith appeared, and he and Rigdon went off together and were gone some months. It was reported that they had gone to Pittsburgh, but whether true or not, no one could say. It was generally believed, however, that Smith at least visited western New York before either returned to Ohio. Soon after their return, the Book of Mormon was announced. Smith was mysterious and silent, assuming familiarity with the supernatural. It was difficult to measure or discover his powers or qualities because of his silence and professions as a prophet. It did not take long, however, to see that he had failed to measure properly those masterly powers of his companion in acting the part of the prophet. In a few months, he saw that he must take a subordinate part. From that time onward, his zeal flagged. He drifted along, though still a leader, until the death of Smith, when he found that Brigham Young, a natural leader of the class of men who composed their followers, held the reins of power with a strong hand. Rigdon became disgusted and disheartened. He soon left them forever and died some years ago in Pennsylvania. 10 years ago, this winter, I spent 2 weeks in Salt Lake City. Elder Orson Pratt had been for many years the historian or theologian of the Mormon Church. As my father had been acquainted with him in his younger days, I called upon him and made myself known. He was then an old man of about 80 years. During our conversation, I inquired of him why it was his people crossed what was called the Great Desert and settled at Salt Lake. He replied that they had Fremont's narrative and that he carried a copy during their journey over the plains and mountains. In the history of the Mormon churches stated that Pratt was with the advance guard, and on their arrival at Salt Lake, Pratt made observations and found the latitude and longitude. Soon after the interview, I examined a copy of Fremont's narrative and found the latitude and longitude given. Now, Pratt was not scholar enough to take an observation of that kind, so he must have announced their locality from the information given by Vermont. It is due to Elder Pratt to say that I do not believe he wrote this statement. He was more of a custodian of Mormon records than a historian, and probably permitted the statement to be made. The Book of Mormon contains many internal evidences that Sidney Rigdon was the author of at least a good portion of it. How many others had a hand in it, or what other manuscripts, if any, assisted in the work, it would be difficult to so determine. And I do agree with that last statement of C.E. Henry. Now, there are some blunders. There's mistakes made in this testimony. We want to point them out. And these were pointed out by Calvary and Davis and Vanek. I'm sorry. They said, number one, Rigdon only lived in Bainbridge, Ohio between 1826 and 1827. Wilbur teaching in the winter following the alliance of Smith and Rigdon would make it 1831. Henry says Rigdon did not preach that winter, but Rigdon did, as historical information is available for those facts. Henry says Smith arrived in Bainbridge to see Rigdon in the spring of 1827, but Rigdon had moved to Mentor, Ohio in March of 1827. Henry says Smith and Rigdon went off together for several months, and that soon after their return, the Book of Mormon was announced. But Rigdon had taken a preaching job at Mentor, which involved him taking over duties as the preacher. And the earliest accounts of the Book of Mormon's forthcoming would be in the spring of 1829, which is 2 years away from Henry's statement. And then, I meant to say that this is the second testimony apart from Amarilla Dunlap that I think is very important. It says, we are in a receipt of a letter from Mr. O.P. Henry, Astoria subscriber, who says in reference to an article in the Oregonian of recent date concerning the origin of the Mormon Bible, that his mother, who is yet alive, lived in the family of Sidney Rigdon for several years prior to her marriage in 1827. That there was in the family was now called a writing medium, also several others in adjacent places. And the Mormon Bible was written by 2 or 3 different persons by an automatic power, which they believe was an inspiration direct from God, the same as produced the original Jewish Bible and Christian New Testament. Mr. Henry believed that Sidney Rigdon furnished Joseph Smith with these manuscripts, and that the story of the hieroglyphics was a fabrication to make the credulous take hold of the mystery. That Rigdon, having learned beyond a doubt that the so-called dead could communicate to the living, considered him duly authorized by Jehovah to found a new church under the divine guidance similar to that of Confucius, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Swedenborg, Calvin, Luther, or Wesley, all of whom believed in and taught the administration of spirits. So I found that a very interesting thing there. Yeah, I accidentally got these out of order, so I'm sorry about this. This is also secondhand testimony here. William Smith, the brother of Joseph Smith, told Joseph if he did not give him some money, he would tell where the Book of Mormon came from, and Joseph accordingly gave him what he wanted. That is secondhand testimony from G.B. Frost. R.W. Arterman says in February 1852, which is once again secondhand testimony, I was snowbound in a hotel in Mentor, Ohio all day. Martin Harris was there, and conversation told me he saw Joe Smith translate the Book of Mormon with his peepstone in his hat. Oliver Cowdery, who had been a schoolteacher, wrote it down. Sidney Rigdon, a renegade preacher, was let in during the translation. Rigdon had stolen a manuscript from a printing office in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which Spalding, who had written in the early part of the century, had left there to be printed. But the printers refused to publish it, and Joe and Rigdon did as the Book of Mormon. Martin said he furnished the means, and Joe promised him a place next to him in the church. When they had got all my property, they set me out. He said Joe ought to have been killed before he was, and that the Mormons committed all sorts of depredations in the towns about Kirtland. They called themselves Latter-day Saints, but he called them Latter-day Devils. And then John C. Bennett says, our remark here in confirmation of the Book of Mormon was originally written by the Reverend Solomon Spalding, as romance and entitled The Manuscript Found. It was placed by him in the printing office of Patterson and Lambden in the city of Pittsburgh, from whence it was taken by conspicuous Mormon divine and remodeled by adding the religious portion placed by him in Smith's possession, and then published to the world as the testimony exemplifies. This I have from the Confederation, and of its perfect correctness there is not the shadow of a doubt. There never were any plates of the Book of Mormon except what were seen by the spiritual and not the natural eyes of the witnesses. The story of the plates is all chimerical. Then you have James Jeffries, who wrote, I know more about the Mormons than any man east of the Alleghenies. Although I've given no attention to the matter for 25 years, I did not know I was in possession of any information concerning the Book of Mormon unknown to others. I suppose that as Rigdon was so open with me, he had told others the same things. 40 years ago, I was in business in St. Louis. The Mormons then had their temple in Nauvoo, Illinois. I had business transactions with them. Sidney Rigdon I knew very well. He was a general manager of the affairs of the Mormons. Rigdon, in the hours of conversation, told me a number of times there was in the printing office which he was connected in Ohio, which he got that detail wrong, a manuscript of Reverend Spalding tracing the origin of the Indian races from the lost tribes of Israel. That this manuscript was in the office for several years, he was familiar with it, and that Spalding had wanted it printed but had not the money to pay for the printing, and that he, Rigdon, and Joe Smith used to look over the manuscript and read it over Sundays. This Mr. Spalding refused. So just to let you know about what he had written. Matilda Davidson then wrote, this Mr. Spalding refused to do for reasons which I cannot now state. Sidney Rigdon, who had figured so largely in the history of the Mormons, was at this time connected with the printing office of Mr. Patterson, as well known in that region, and as Rigdon himself has frequently stated. Here he had ample opportunity to become acquainted with Mr. Spalding's manuscript and to copy it if he so chose. Now, here's the interesting thing about all this to me. We don't. It's true, of course, in 1834 that Mormonism Unveiled was released by E.D. Howe. But I just find it kind of interesting over the years. You can find and see how there were several witnesses who point out, such as, first of all, in Pittsburgh, you got Rebecca Eichbaum, who worked at the post office. And then you have, of course, I know it's secondhand testimony, but you have those who said that John Winter saw that Sidney Rigdon showed him in 1822 a manuscript that he said was Spalding's manuscript. And then you have how in Amity, Pennsylvania, Joseph Miller, and he took care of Spalding during that time, and he said that Solomon Spalding had told him that he had that Rigdon had taken the manuscript. You also have the same thing with Reddick McKee, and we also see the same thing from Matilda Davidson, his former wife. And then in Bainbridge, Ohio, we have two witnesses who both lived with the Rigdon family for a time. Amarillo Dunlap, the niece, and then Dempsey Thompson. And then you'll have a time where you'll remember that the last place that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon lived was in Nauvoo, Illinois. And John C. Bennett actually was a person who got into very close to Solomon Spalding. In fact, Sidney Rigdon during this time was very sick, it was said, and so he wasn't able to help out Joseph Smith. So he became a very close confidant with Joseph Smith. And he says he received his information from the Confederation, which was the very close friends group of Joseph Smith. And then you got St. Louis, Missouri, and James Jeffrey. And we know that, you'll remember that when Joseph Smith died in Carthage, Illinois, we know that Rigdon, he journeyed from Pittsburgh up to, I guess it was Nauvoo where he went. And they had, tried to propose that he should be the next leader in the LDS Church. And of course, Brigham Young was the one that won out. And Sidney Rigdon was hurt and he left. And he obviously went through St. Louis and he must have told James Jeffrey of this, which I find very interesting. So, if you want to read this again, so you can remember also that Rebecca Eichbaum states that Sidney Rigdon and Solomon Spalding received their mail there. John Winter boarded with Rigdon sometime in 1822 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it was said that he saw a copy of a manuscript found that Rigdon told him belonged to Spalding. And you can read that for yourself. And I named off all these things. Yeah. So when Reagan lost the leadership position to Brigham Young in the 12, he was so frustrated and evidently let the cat out of the bag when he decided to vent out all the secrets that had been kept to James Jeffrey in St. Louis, Missouri. And probably those secrets also involved the spiritual wifery doctrine, I'm sure. Okay, so we're going to stop there and let this be for next time. Really appreciate you being with us. I'll be back in just a few minutes.